Today's conversation is with Jerry DeMarco. Jerry is currently Canada's Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, a job that I held for about 5 years from 2014 to 2019. I met Jerry way back in the day when we were campaigning for the Species at Risk Act. Jerry is a lawyer and he went to work for some other organization. And I just remember him calling me every year or so when I was commissioner to find out when I was leaving so that he could apply for the job. He applied and he got it. So I think listening to Jerry and his career path will be a fascinating podcast.
Hello, my name is Bridget Vandenberg. I am a third-year geography student at the University of Guelph, and today I am interviewing Commissioner Jerry DeMarco. Hello, Commissioner. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So for students who may not be familiar with your position, could you explain your main responsibilities as the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development?
Sure, I'm happy to. So as part of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, I provide Parliament, that's Canada's federal parliament, with audits and other reports on government programs and activities related to the environment and sustainable development. So our auditors play a critical role in providing parliamentarians and Canadians with objective, independent analysis of and recommendations on the federal government's various efforts to protect the environment, mitigate the effects of climate change, and foster sustainable development. We typically report to Parliament twice a year, and the position that I occupy as Commissioner has actually existed since 1995, when Canada's Auditor General Act was amended to include several provisions relating to the environment and sustainable development. And ever since then, the Commissioner has been appointed as a senior officer within our office by the Auditor General. We also manage the environmental petitions process, which is a way for Canadians to bring their concerns about environmental issues to the federal government. And the Commissioner's role has grown over the years. For example, I'm now required to examine and report on the government's implementation of climate change mitigation measures under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And another requirement is that every few years the Commissioner must comment on the draft federal sustainable development strategy and review that strategy's implementation annually, and also examine the fairness of the federal government's reporting on sustainable development. So there's quite a few roles, but our mainstay is to conduct performance audits of the federal government in the field of environment and sustainable development within the Office of the Auditor General.
Wow, that is quite a few responsibilities. So what does a typical workday entail for you then?
Well, it varies from day to day, but it's a mix of corporate responsibilities and those that are more particularly associated with my role as Commissioner. So given the nature of your studies, I think I'll focus my answer on my statutory role as Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, as opposed to the corporate work of, executive meetings and that sort of thing. So I have to remain focused on our reports to Parliament because those are the products that I'm required to produce under the Auditor General Act. And as a lawyer, I obviously want to make sure that I follow our legislation. And we get our marching orders in the environment and sustainable development area from about 11 different provisions across 3 different statutes, and I pay very close attention to following those mandates provided by Parliament. So a typical day at this time of the year involves being immersed in 3 different sets of 4 or 5 reports that are at different points in their annual cycle. So we'd have a group that are just starting, and they will be finishing, say, a year from now. We have ones that are midstream, and then we have the ones that are just about complete. And so at a given time, I'm working with our excellent teams of auditors and communication staff and others in the office on around 15 reports or so across 3 different cycles. So for the ones that are going to be released this spring, so that's coming up quite soon, I'm working with our audit teams and communication staff on finalizing these reports, dealing with the responses from the government departments that we audited, and preparing for the upcoming busy day when the Parliament receives our tabled reports. And that comes with a press conference and a public hearing before a parliamentary committee. Preparing for tabling day, which is a big day that happens several times of the year across our office for both the Auditor General and for me. Preparing for that day brings together many parts of our office for a team effort. So working on those reports and preparing for tabling is a big part of my day. Over the past few years, due to increased interest in our reports from parliamentarians, about once or twice a month now, when Parliament is in session, I also prepare for and act as a witness, along with our auditors from the office, in parliamentary committee hearings. So to give you an example, last week, 4 of us testified about 3 of our reports before a Senate committee that deals with energy and environment matters. And the 3 committees that I've appeared before the most in my time as commissioner have been that Senate committee, plus 2 committees of the House of Commons, the one that deals with environment and sustainable development, and one that's called the Public Accounts Committee. But of late, we've also been invited to other committees of Parliament to testify, including those on government operations, natural resources, agriculture, fisheries, and so on. So it's really great to see all the interest in our reports, but it does make for a busy and sometimes unpredictable schedule as hearings get scheduled and then rescheduled, all while we're trying to prepare and table our reports, of course. But that's much better than the alternative, which would be if our reports were ignored and we didn't have any hearings, then that would be a sign that we weren't providing a lot of value to Canadians. So it's better to be busy and preparing for hearings and tabling reports than not, of course. And so finally, as an environment and sustainable development focused individual in the office, and given the expectations that parliamentarians have of me when testifying before all these committees, I do spend a lot of time, whether during the workday or otherwise, keeping very up to date on environment and sustainable development matters. And because there's so much activity in the field, it's almost a full-time job just maintaining the expertise to be able to speak in an informed way about the environment and sustainable development.
So you've mentioned a bit about your background, about how you're a lawyer, and you've mentioned quite the wide range of the work that you do. But you also have quite an extensive academic background spanning environmental studies, law, science, and management. So how have these different disciplines shaped the way that you approach your position as the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development?
Well, it's an interesting question and one I've been asked a few times. I'll go back to my environmental studies program many years ago. And in that building where our faculty shared it with the chemistry department, there was a sign above the chemistry wing that said, "What in the world isn't chemistry?" And as I was in the environmental program at the time, I often said to myself, well, what in the world isn't the environment? Just about everything you can think of relates to the environment and sustainable development in some way, especially since sustainable development includes both environmental factors as well as socioeconomic factors. So because environment and sustainable development issues touch on so many different matters and so many disciplines, I personally felt that I needed to better understand as many angles as possible to help address our growing environmental challenges. So, siloed thinking, either by discipline or by department and so on, is one of the reasons that government has had so much trouble solving our immense challenges in the environment and sustainable development. So I sought to learn about as many of these different silos or disciplines as reasonably possible so that I could promote a more integrated approach to better decision making. Indeed, in my specific field of study in that program, the environmental studies program, it was integrated environmental planning that I was focused on. And that really is working across disciplines, across sectors, across departments and levels of government to make better decisions that simultaneously achieve environmental, economic, and social objectives. So I would say that either learning about various disciplines as I have or carrying out interdisciplinary studies within just one program, as you're doing, Either of those approaches works, of course. It's a great way of gaining insight into how decisions are made and the different perspectives that different types of decision makers have within their disciplines or government departments. So my background, my multidisciplinary background, has had a profound impact on my work as commissioner. And I'll give you an example, a tangible example. So rather than auditing a given program by one department, which is typical for performance auditors, and respecting those silos that exist in government, I often ask our teams to look at many of the issues we audit from multiple angles, and where possible, audit a topic. Say, the title of one of our reports is Climate Change in Forests, as opposed to just one program within that topic as managed by one particular government department. This can make for more complicated audits, but they become more informed audits as well. I also take this further by meeting regularly with the commissioners in Ontario and Quebec, which have audit offices with a commissioner embedded in them like we do. And then expanding that out even further, once a year our office meets with other audit offices doing environmental and sustainable development auditing in other countries to share practices and discuss how we can address some global challenges together. So this integrated approach recognizes that we face complex issues in meeting today's environmental and sustainable development challenges, and a multidisciplinary approach certainly helps my understanding of those complex issues.
So you've talked about, I would say, your passion about this, but what originally motivated you to pursue a career in environmental policy and sustainable development? And was there a particular moment in your life that sparked your interest in this field?
That's a tough question, trying to pinpoint it at one moment in time. I think that does happen with certain people, but I think things started slowly with me, just being generally interested in nature, or, as Rachel Carson calls it, having a sense of wonder for the natural world. So I grew up in southwestern Ontario, where agriculture is the dominant land use, but there was a small patch of woods behind our house in Essex County, and also a small patch of native tallgrass prairie down the street. And then not too far away in the southern part of the county was Point Pelee National Park, which is a major migratory bird stopover point. So it's perhaps unsurprising, being a product of our environment, that I became interested in birds and flora and fauna more generally from a young age. I think I started my bird list, and I can't say for sure because my memory is a bit vague from those days, but I think I started my bird list when I was about 4 years old. And it's funny that you use the term "what sparked my interest," because there's a term called the spark bird, which is how do ornithologists or bird watchers become interested in birds, and often it's because of a particular spark bird. But getting back to my interest generally on the environment, a key spark for me was when I started to believe that environmental issues could go from an interest or a hobby of mine to a career interest. And I would say there was no particular moment, but it was rather a gradual realization during my undergrad studies in the 1980s that I could stitch together my interests in biology, geography, resource management, land use planning, law, etc., into a career in what was then a very nascent field of environment and sustainable development. There weren't many environmental programs. You have the luxury of choosing between among a lot of them now, but there weren't very many back then, and there wasn't any at my hometown university. So I sort of created my own environmental program by selecting certain courses at the university, and also as a visiting student during the summers, going to other universities, so sort of patched together what I thought was an interesting course of study. So that was sort of an important point or series of points in my undergrad years where I started thinking about nature and the environment as something I could work in as a career as opposed to just a hobby or an interest. But I would say, going back to my childhood, those childhood experiences of nature with my parents and siblings in Essex County, and then coupled with reading about the tragic extinction of the very abundant passenger pigeon, that story certainly was a spark for me about how humanity could do better in its relationship with the natural environment. There was a specimen of the of the extinct passenger pigeon in the visitor center of the national park near our house, and I certainly looked at that and read the story, and it motivated me. But I think it took another 10 years or more before I thought I could do a career in the area as opposed to be something that I was just interested in. I guess I should add, given the backdrop to this, to where we are right now with my late mother's painting behind me, I should also mention, as also with the political times that we're in right now, that the energy crisis that was happening in the 1970s when I was in grade school led to a lot of conservation efforts, and I remember working with the help of my mom in making a contribution to a conservation poster contest as a young grade school student. I don't have that poster anymore, but I can remember that it talked about turning off the lights, stopping dripping taps, closing the curtains at night to conserve resources. All of this is still good advice today. I don't have the prize anymore from winning that poster contest that my mom helped me out with, but that's because the prize was a very large chocolate bar, and I'm glad I don't have it still many years later. But that was another important point, is in terms of growing up also during the energy crisis of the 1970s.
So heading back towards your career a little bit. So before becoming the commissioner, you worked as the Commissioner of the Environment and the Assistant Auditor General at the Office of the Auditor General of Ontario. So how did that experience prepare you for your current role?
Well, that was a really important experience because, though as we've discussed, I've been immersed in the environment and sustainable development field my whole career, I had no background in auditing at all. So there are really only three places where one can be an environment or sustainable development commissioner within an audit office, and those are Quebec, Ontario, and the Federal Auditor General Office. So having served at the provincial level in Ontario, it was a good fit for me to make a move to a similar role, but at the federal level, with the audit experience I had gained in Ontario. I would say probably without that experience in Ontario, I don't think I would have been as strong a candidate for landing this current position at the federal level. Having said that, I really did enjoy my time as commissioner in Ontario as well, and I certainly would have been happy to continue doing that role had the federal position not become vacant at the time that it did.
When transitioning into the role of Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, so did you face any challenges, and how did you overcome them?
I definitely faced challenges, and probably at least one of them I'm still facing. So I guess the two main challenges were the unusual situation of transitioning to an entirely new organization and new level of government. Although I had been doing some adjudicative work at the federal level, I wasn't immersed on a day-to-day basis in the federal government. So transitioning to a new organization where I didn't know anyone during the time when there were COVID restrictions was a challenge. And then also trying to learn as much as possible about the federal government structure in relation to both my new office and the governance relating to environment and sustainable development. Learning that quickly was also a challenge. So I guess for the first one, I took on more administrative duties in my new position whenever that was 5+ years ago now. I'm just looking down at the calendar, and that allowed me, through participating in a lot of meetings within the office, perhaps too many in that first year, but I got a better sense of the people in the organization and how things worked within our office. And my new colleagues really welcomed me with open arms virtually, and facilitated my onboarding, even though I didn't get to meet any of them in person for many months later. In fact, if I recall correctly, I tabled my first set of reports for Parliament from a video feed like this in my kitchen with the same background as we are using today because of the COVID restrictions. So that was definitely a challenge. And then the second aspect about learning about the federal government, I would say that's still a challenge for me. I'm still learning, even 5+ years in. And I think it's partly because I don't seem to fully accept how slowly things have changed within the federal government. I've tried to understand why this is so. And I still wonder why Canada can make so many important commitments on the environment and sustainable development, but be so painfully slow in implementing them in terms of actual on-the-ground results. Our office's vision focuses on contributing to a better Canada, but we just make recommendations. It's up to the government to implement our recommendations once they're accepted and to take the steps they need to actually fix the problems, whether it's climate, biodiversity, Indigenous reconciliation, sustainable development, or any other issue. But the wheels move very slowly, and I'm not sure I'll ever come to the point where I fully understand why that is so, and maybe it doesn't have to be that so. So maybe that way. So maybe I will never fully understand it, and maybe Canada will get to the point where it can do a better job of implementing its environmental commitments in a more timely manner. So that's a second challenge, is sort of understanding the machinery of government, and it is quite a slow machine sometimes.
Did you find that there was any skills that were the most important to you as you changed positions?
Flexibility certainly was a key thing. Subject matter expertise in the environment and sustainable development was important, so that I didn't have to learn a new field and a new position at the same time. Certainly a willingness to increase my abilities in French, given the federal role. That was important. And then I think probably what was really important, and it's not so much a skill but a perspective, was that there's a really good fit between my own perspective in terms of promoting the public interest and improving the common good, and our organization's vision of a better Canada. So we're focused on better outcomes, not just better process, and that's something that fits well with my mindset. So that skill or attribute or whatever you want to call it would have been important. These all made the switch much easier, but it wasn't all positive. I mean, saying goodbye to my friends at my old office, though I still see several of them annually, which is nice, but that was difficult. Letting go of my deeper knowledge of the Ontario government in terms of environment and sustainable development, and then having to learn more about the federal government, that was a challenge. But I would say a willingness to be flexible and trying a new position, which I already done a few times in my career, from litigator to manager of an organization to adjudicator to commissioner. All of those changes or steps in the evolution of my career were based on the fact of not just being comfortable with whatever was familiar and whatever my present position was, but being willing to step outside of my comfort zone and be flexible to try something new. I think that's key to both personal growth and professional growth in terms of one's career.
So you've gone over some of the challenges that you faced, but what were some of the most valuable lessons that you learned during this particular stage of your career?
Valuable lessons. There's so many. How long is this podcast? I'll better keep it short, which is not necessarily something I'm great at doing, but I'll pick one. So. One of them is that many of the solutions to our environment and sustainable development problems, whether it's climate change, biodiversity loss, or various sustainable development matters like Indigenous reconciliation or in Canada or poverty reduction, many of the solutions are already known or largely known. I'm sure there'll be technological improvements and so on, but there's a lot of solutions at hand. And the lesson is that even if there are solutions at hand, there are still a lot of impediments to putting those solutions into action. So that realization, using the words of your question, actually, lessons learned, led to an innovation on our part over the last few years. We've innovated our practices at the Office of the Auditor General to complement our individual audit reports about programs and topics with some lessons learned reports. And I'll just grab these from my desk here. But these lessons learned reports on climate change and on sustainable development are a new product line for us. And it came from the recognition that if Canada wasn't improving its environment and sustainable development performance in a timely manner based on our individual audit reports, maybe we should create a new line of reports where we bring together lessons learned in these particular instances on climate and sustainable development to look at the bigger picture, and innovating in this way was a lesson not only that we learned, but it's the actual title of the innovation that I'm talking about, innovating in the types of reports we give to Parliament. And these lessons learned reports have been very well received by parliamentarians. I was just speaking about them last week in the hearing that I spoke about earlier in this podcast, and they're essential. Innovating is essential for remaining relevant or becoming relevant for your audiences, whether that's parliamentarians or Canadians. So that would be one important lesson, is to adapt and evolve as the needs of your audiences change, and also with the recognition that perhaps what you've been doing in the past has worked to some extent and you're comfortable doing it, but maybe better results could be achieved by trying something new. So there's so many lessons. I think I'll leave it at that. I'm a lifelong learner and always learning lessons. But that's the one that comes to mind, partly because of the wording of your question and the title of those two reports.
So you've talked about adapting and changing, but early in your career, what types of experiences helped you build the skills necessary to work at the level you do now?
Yeah, so I think I've covered that in part about understanding various disciplines. I guess one other aspect that I didn't cover is understanding different sectors. So during university, I worked in the private sector for a bit during the summers. I worked in the charitable sector for many years at the outset of my legal career, and then of course government sector nowadays, as well as a lot of exposure as a student or as a teaching or research assistant in academic settings. So a broad range of experiences in all of these sectors really helps me now in a position where I need to look at that big picture in order to make good recommendations to government on how to improve their performance, because they're representing the public interest within the context of all of these other sectors that are operating on the landscape. So that would be another aspect that I would emphasize, not only different disciplines, but different sectors, and having experience outside of government in order to inform my work in a more wide-ranging way.
Following up on the experiences, for students interested in sustainability careers, what kind of experiences or opportunities should they seek out or prioritize early on?
So I think I've covered some of that in terms of what I was studying and in the areas I worked in. I guess the one thing I would add that I haven't covered at all yet in this interview is my extensive volunteer work, both when I was in university and we were just helping set up an environmental awareness organization within the university back then in the 80s, and then in my career too. The volunteering opened a lot of doors, but it also kept me motivated towards promoting that public interest that I talked about earlier. So when you're volunteering, you often feel like you're accomplishing something very tangible. And you're also surrounded by people who are very well intentioned and also trying to contribute to the public good. So it's quite a positive space to be in, even if it does add more commitments to your busy agenda in terms of classes and papers and exams and so on and work. But a volunteer experience, I'm just thinking about last month's experience where I was helping to judge a competition for environmental law students, where they come together once every year or two to have a competition practicing to be a lawyer, even though they're not quite lawyers yet. And so that was one way where I contribute to fostering the next generation in the environmental field. So I feel that volunteering helps build important skills that help you later on in your career and help you in life more generally, to be honest. Working in the environment and sustainable development field is sometimes quite daunting, given the troubling trend lines for biodiversity or decline, or for atmospheric, greenhouse gas concentrations increasing. So mixing in some, tangible volunteer work where the work you're doing every day, helps motivate you and is a good balance to the work I do, which is more on a longer term horizon. And as I said, somewhat daunting, these long-term challenges that we're facing. So that would be one thing that I would add to my earlier answers.
So you've mentioned how you feel accomplished when you do volunteer work, but what has been the most rewarding aspect of your career working in environment and sustainability?
Well, you've got some good questions here, especially for an auditor. I talked about a better Canada and the vision for our office, so we try to focus on outcomes, right? Not just outputs, and that's a big difference in terms of tracking government performance. So I'll do the easy thing and I'll start with a few outputs, but then I'll try to tackle outcomes because ultimately that's what matters. So I guess in terms of outputs, I already held up a couple of examples, but all of the commissioner reports we have issued, including those new product line reports on lessons learned. Those very rewarding team efforts from our office where everyone comes together and produce these reports that usually take about a year to produce, and it's nice to publish them and so on. But the degree of interest in those those reports from Parliament has been very rewarding. It's hard to attribute particular on-the-ground outcomes to the publication of a report. But when positive changes happen after a report is published, you recognize that maybe you're a part of that positive change amongst all the other factors at play, political and otherwise. A convincing report isn't enough just to affect change, generally speaking, but it can help in the ecosystem of decision making that happens. Another thing to point out would be, when I participate in annual international meetings and hear from other audit institutions, so essentially our colleagues in all the other, approximately 200 countries around the world, about how great they think our reports are from the Office of the Auditor General and how they've used our reports, to improve their work on the global challenges that are affecting us, such as those in the environment and sustainable development. That's certainly rewarding, and I know that having received an award for one of those recent reports was a bit of an emotional moment when we did that, and it was certainly rewarding. I should add that I find it equally rewarding learning from our international colleagues in the other audit institutions around the world about how we can improve our work in Canada as a result of learning from them. So it's very much a two-way street in terms of rewarding work. We're all in this together, and it is rewarding to work on collective action problems together with our colleagues around the world, even though the majority of our work is focused here in Canada, of course. I guess in terms of other outputs across my career arc, there, having worked on co-authoring a couple of editions of a book on environmental law, a lot of journal articles, and hundreds of adjudicative decisions and orders that were thankfully not overturned on appeal. Those were also rewarding experiences. In terms of outcomes, that's a tough one, and it shouldn't be as tough a one as it is for a performance auditor. But let me take a stab at it, because it's very subjective. This first example I have, I guess, is very subjective. But I would say improving the organizations that I've worked in has been incredibly rewarding, especially at the people level, the interpersonal level. Having great working relationships along the way and building an organization up better is something that's been particularly rewarding. And having one of those organizations being recognized in a UN report as exhibiting best practices, for example, some sort of outside validation that you're doing the right thing. But organizations are people; they're made up of people after all, and having an outcome of positive relationships as you build an organization up is important. But I feel like I better give you one really tangible example. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would pass a performance audit of myself today. So, for the type of work I'm doing now, we make recommendations, and it's not up to us to actually affect change directly in terms of decision making. But one outcome earlier in my career, when I was a litigator, was a case up at the Supreme Court of Canada about pesticide use. And it set an important precedent that was not only important for lawyers, but also for municipal governments and the charitable organizations I was representing in the court case, in terms of actually reducing the use of and the associated pollution from unnecessary use of pesticides in many municipalities across Canada. And our work on that was recognized by a leadership award that I was lucky enough to be presented with by one of the larger municipalities in Canada. And that case about pesticides was profiled in this recent book about litigating Canada's environment, leading Canadian environmental cases. So it's, working on a precedent-setting case like that, precedent-setting in terms of law, but also precedent-setting in terms of the on-the-ground outcomes, in terms of reducing pesticide pollution on behalf of our clients with municipal governments and the charitable organizations we were representing.
So we've talked about your extensive education and your career now. If you could do things all over again, would you choose the same path for yourself?
Well, that's another good question. I'm not sure if you did it on purpose, but you have the wording in several questions that sort of pushes the right buttons for performance auditors in terms of putting them on the spot. As an auditor, we're often looking back at what a government has done and providing recommendations on what they could have done to do better and maybe do better next time. So we're kind of doing what your question asks all the time, but it's, when you put it to me, it's a bit more difficult to answer. Let me say this about the path, I guess, that I took. I was pretty sure, definitely sure by the end of my undergrad that I wanted to be in the environment and sustainable development field for my career. That was soon after that realization that it could be a career field as opposed to an interest or a hobby. So that path has been pretty much followed. But when I applied to law school at that time, I thought I'd be an environmental litigator for my entire career. I was pretty much certain about that, and I recall writing that up in my pitch in my application. So I ended up on that path for almost a decade, for sure. But I was motivated to try some new things afterwards. So the path, including this one right now that I'm on as commissioner, were not in my mind earlier in my career, other than it being in the environmental field or the sustainable development field. And I guess that makes sense because there was no such thing as environmental and sustainable development commissioners in audit offices when I started law school, because it was so long ago. Those positions were created subsequent to that. So I'm happy with the path that I took. It was by no means the only path available for someone who had the interests that I had in order to be satisfied. And there's a danger if you're too focused on a very specific path and it doesn't turn out because of whatever reason, for example, that a position that you're really interested in doesn't become vacant for many years, or the position disappears or something. That could be very disappointing. So returning back to a theme I mentioned earlier about flexibility, it's good to have a path, but also good to have some flexibility in pursuing a path, recognizing that there's more than one path available in one's lifetime. You don't have complete control over those paths as well. Opportunities come up, obstacles come up, life events come up. So a degree of flexibility is never a bad idea. But I would say I didn't know the path I was ultimately on until I took it. But I don't feel like I took the wrong path, if that answers your question.
We're on to our final question. Is there one piece of advice that you would give students who are interested in careers in environmental policy or sustainability?
Well, that's a tough one, because your earlier questions have been good at prompting me to cover a lot of those aspects. I don't think I can answer anything. I can add anything more on that's specific to the environment or sustainability. But maybe at a general level, I guess I could say that you probably get advice about what's good for your resume, or what positions you well in terms of competing against other candidates. That's all good advice, of course, and I've taken some of that advice over my career. But rather than rehash that or emphasize that, I would say, I never forgot what felt right in terms of my own interests and convictions. So that was always something that was important to me when I considered, a major change from litigator to adjudicator, or to manager of a government organization, or to commissioner now. Each of those changes, I sort of ground truth against what felt right in terms of my own interests and convictions. So I would say following your heart is equally important in the long run. It may involve following an evolving path that has a lot of twists and turns as your interests change, as relationships change, as your knowledge evolves. And having that flexibility to do that may not be best for everyone. I'm not recommending that for everyone, but I offer it as something to consider. It may not be as practical as a type of advice as you might be expecting, but things might not always go as you hope, or as you intend, or as you plan. But feeling that you've stayed true to yourself in whatever you're doing, I think that goes a long way in my view.
That's actually really great advice, I think. All right, so that's all the questions I had for you today. Thank you so much.